Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. When Jimmy Carter was president, he said the country's tax system was a disgrace to the human race. But he didn't know what to do about it, and so therefore he did nothing. I don't know if anyone ever really knows what to do, but there's always a lot of talk about doing something, especially during presidential campaigns. I thought Martha Stark, the finance commissioner of this city, would have some thoughts, and I'm delighted to have her here today to talk about them with her. So, what do you think about our tax system?
Oh, great. You know, I don't know if I would use the same Jimmy Carter quote,
right.
But it's certain that our taxes are completely crazy, very difficult for people to understand, and I think far too often we lose the connection to why taxes. So I don't know if I would call them a disgrace. I think that they need a lot of work, constant attention. I mean, not unlike your car, you know, you need to change the oil every now and then and make sure that it's running in good order. And we definitely have a tax system that's in need of some changes.
The tax, when we do change it, we don't ever look at the whole thing, right? It's just going to be a part. Is that right, or do we look at the whole thing?
Well, I think unfortunately, far too often we do little piecemeal changes and not enough looking at the system as a whole. Although there are some instances where people think more broadly about tax changes and how to either implement new taxes to recognize new activities or to actually get rid of taxes that don't make a lot of sense.
The basic reason for taxes is to raise revenue to pay for the expenses of our governments, right?
Right. I guess I would say it a little bit differently. I would say the reason why you tax is to provide services, and services cost money, and you have to pay for them somehow, and there are lots of sort of strategies for how you would pay. And I think what's interesting about our system is, you know, we have a federalist system, and there's some fiscal federalism. So you would imagine that you want to have people, you know, the broadest group of people pay for taxes to benefit things that for all of us would benefit from. So defense, for example. I mean, regardless of what you think about the war, the fact is that the best way to raise revenue for defense spending is from all of us around the country. You can kind of go down to the state level. If there are sort of state services that are provided, the best pool of money for that is from a state, broad pool of state people. And then there are local services, which I know a little more about as a city's finance commissioner. But in that regard, you want to make sure you have the broadest tax base to provide for services that are going to benefit people. And the sort of theory of taxation, I think it ranges from, you know, are you taxing people because they directly receive benefits and you want to compensate for those, or is there some overall government purpose that you think people will want to support? And
so your definition is a better definition because it includes a philosophic concept that there is a common public good.
That's absolutely correct. And a belief in a common public good that when people are told about, they wouldn't beg to differ. So for example, our education system, certainly lots of ways in which it can be improved, but we believe in a public education system, and in order to fund that public education system, you need some tax revenues. And what's the best source for those tax revenues? Typically, it's local, although you want support from the federal government and the state government, but whatever they're not paying, you're going to try to get from a sort of local, broad-based group of people.
Do you think it's better actually to finance it locally than it is to finance it nationally?
Well, you know, we have an interesting situation in New York City that takes out of local public education financing some of the difficulties many places, for example, at the county level, run into. So, you know, you're in Nassau County. If you happen to be in a locality that has low property values, you have a hard time funding your education system. Since we're one city, we actually do our taxes as if we're sort of a small state. And so the burden of it isn't borne by localities that can't really afford to pay it. So it's actually I think our funding mechanism is the better funding mechanism than saying local governments are going to pay
in the state. Most of the counties in New York State fund their local education needs out of their property taxes.
That is correct. That's
right.
And
that's why you get the objections sometimes to the high, or you get it voted against, right?
Absolutely. Or why you need state funding to really tip that balance, to make it a more broader scale. That's
because
exactly right.
Because some wealthy communities spend much more money on doing it. And in New York, We take it out of the general what we call general revenue?
That's correct. Although a substantial amount of the property tax, again, if you were to start with your original premise, you know, if you think about which taxes go to support what services that are being provided, and again, from a federalism standpoint, we've got a little bit of a broken sort of thing here. So, for example, New York City pays for a lot of state-like services, and you know, what comes to mind is welfare and Medicaid costs, where most other cities don't have to pay for those costs. Their state pays for them. I did a study actually working with my former boss, Carol O'Clerican, on DC's finances. And what I used to say is the only thing worse than being New York City when it comes to this is being the District of Columbia, because they're in a far worse sort of situation. But the bottom line is they pass on to us huge amounts of costs associated with Medicaid. I think it's really just a question of New York City has more poor people, and so given that you have more poor people, and I think if I were to be cynical, you know, and you're not doing anything to get rid of your poor people, then you should bear the cost of that.
And that's determined by the state legislature and the governor.
That's exactly right. And that is very unique in New York. So if you were to go out to Chicago, for example, the state of Illinois, essentially, Chicago only pays 5% of their cost of Medicaid, and we pay 25% of the share, which is huge. It's worth $3.5 billion in our budget. So given that we have these state-like responsibilities, how do you have a broad enough tax base that's going to pay for those state-like responsibilities? And what we've done in the city is come up with a diverse array of taxes that sometimes look more like a state than like a city. So your point earlier about the city, most cities typically rely on their property taxes. We don't rely on our property tax as much because we have some broader based taxes. So we have a business tax that we impose at the income sort of level. I think you might have heard me testify a little bit. We have an unincorporated business tax. We have a personal income tax. Most cities don't have a personal income tax. And all of that is to actually make sure we have the funding to provide the services that we're actually required to.
Are we able as a city to legislate those taxes, or do we have to go to Albany?
Most of the taxes, except for the property tax, Albany needs to approve our ability to do it, as well as to change the rates.
So it's very interesting because this really points out the political influence on taxation, right? I mean, Albany is essentially, the bodies in Albany are essentially suburban and rural areas, right?
Right.
New York City and Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, maybe.
Yonkers.
They're viewed upon the same way as in the city council. Manhattan is viewed as the expensive borough. People who live in Manhattan are all rich, and therefore they should, you know, do this or do that, and you're a little crazy to live in such a dense place. And I think that's the same phenomena in Albany. So they've created this thing where you're forced to pay for your extra stuff because you're a big city, right?
Well, you know, I would say that that's definitely a way of looking at it. And the other thing is the power to tax really rests with the state. I mean, that's what the Constitution says. And the state feels like, and it's probably true, they're giving us the privilege to be able to tax our residents. And otherwise, the state would have to do it, or we would have to rely on traditional local sources of revenue, which is, you know, property tax, even though the state set up the structure governing the property tax.
With the exception, they exempted New York City from the state structure.
But it's still the structure that's established by them. I mean, that's really relevant. So we can decide at the city level, subject to some state constitutional restrictions, that we want $1 from the city property tax, or we want $15 billion from the city property. So we have that control, but the rest of the structural system is set up
that's what
state
Mayor Bloomberg raised the property tax, right?
He did,
18%?
18.5%.
And he did that in order to really pay for the services that we need.
Absolutely. And I think, again, that was a really good decision that the mayor made post 9/11, that he was not going to sacrifice services, and that what we needed at that time was to continue to provide the same, if not better, level of services to make sure that people were going to stay in the city. And the way to do that was to get the revenue.
Did he do that with the eye to making it temporary?
I think what I would say is that you did it with an eye towards making sure the city had some fiscal stability. And that's a key sort of thing. Again, remember, the personal income tax, if you think about it, your income today could be very high, and tomorrow it could be very low. And as a result, the income tax goes up and down and goes actually in some ways. That's absolutely right. Whereas a property tax, no matter what, it's stable, and you get a little less development sometimes, a little more, but the steady stream of income that you can generate from the property tax, everyone calls it the stabilizer. It is the budget stabilizer.
And we see the difference with the incomes with Wall Street.
Absolutely.
As the finance center does well, we have a lot of revenue, and as we fear that it's not going to do as well.
Absolutely. A huge amount of, about 40% of the city's revenue is tied sensitively to Wall Street. Now, there's groups out there who will tell you that is not a sustainable structure. We really need to figure out a way to be a little less reliant on Wall Street for revenue. But you're right. Right now, we're looking, and OMB is tracking what's going to happen with bonuses in December. And if there's a huge dip in bonuses, it's going to have a adverse effect on
OMB being the budget
revenue. Our budget office, yes.
Yeah. It's so interesting because there's so many contradictions. I mean, we get a lot of money so we can pay for services by what I consider to be almost immoral practices of giving these enormous bonuses to people who are working on Wall Street. So it seemed to me the bonuses last year were almost half of the city's expense budget.
It was tremendous. I mean, tremendous.
Over
amount
$25 billion.
Bonuses.
Was that right?
So, don't you want to be in that business? Just joking.
No, I don't think so, and I don't even know how to save money. There's always a lot of talk during presidential elections, and it seems to me that they're putting this tax policy out to substitute for problems in the government.
Interesting.
They talk about a middle-income tax credit. Well, how much does a middle-income family, say, of $50,000 get in some of these tax credits they're proposing, or tax benefits?
Well, it's typically a pretty small amount. I mean, those of us who are I call us tax geeks, actually take a look at and say, who's going to really benefit from any of the tax cuts that are being proposed. And it's clear that, at least in this federal administration, the bulk of the beneficiaries are at the very, very high end of the salary scale. A major issue for New York City right now, and as it relates to federal taxes, has to do with the alternative minimum tax. I don't know if you remember, the notion, one of the great things about state and local government was your ability to export taxes to the federal level. And the way that you did that was through deductions. So at the federal level, if you could deduct your state and local taxes or your property tax, I won't talk about mortgage interest for now, that was a really a hallmark,
a very good thing,
absolutely, of tax policy around this country. And the alternative minimum tax, which was set up, when you talk what's the history of taxes, was set up basically in the mid-1970s to address basically about 15 taxpayers who were very wealthy and were not paying federal taxes because they could deduct a whole lot of things. And the government,
so it had good intentions.
Yeah, well, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, isn't it? But what ended up happening is they wanted to figure out how to tax those folks, and they put in this alternative calculation that basically takes away your state and local tax deduction and allows you to pay at this different rate. All right, great idea back then. Not at all adjusted for inflation. And so now, today, basically hitting more and more taxpayers, and the city, 40% of our local taxpayers are going to be paying the alternative minimum tax, which means that their state and local tax deductions are worth nothing to them. So it really affects how we think about it from a policy perspective.
It does affect us because our property tax, which, as you know, I complain about all the time because they're very high, we can't deduct it from our federal taxes.
That is exactly
right. And that is the final thing. So what we do is that, I don't want to get into this argument because we've had it before. And I don't have to argue with you because you understand it totally, is that when I get the $400 check rebate, I laugh, and that's about it. Anyway, so what would a middle income, when they talk about middle income, first of all, what are they talking about when they talk about middle income?
Exactly. How do you just decide who is middle income? And I think that I would say, again, not to be cynical, but it's, trying to find a target population that basically votes, right?
That they want to vote.
Figure out exactly how to make sure that they know to pay the right amount. Now, one of the things that I have to say I've liked about Mayor Bloomberg and working for him is that I think one of the important things that we can do as elected officials, or you're doing this show, is to remind people about what taxes pay for. Because I think that if you said to a middle-income New Yorker, would you like me to cut your taxes $200? Well, sure. If I tell it to you in that vacuum, yes. Well, would you like me to cut your taxes $200? Sure. You don't really care about the $400 rebate and could send it back. But if you say, but I'm using this revenue to actually provide great government services. So we are a safer city because of safe streets, safe cities, and the investment in police and the targeted great enforcement that our police commissioners have done. We will be and have great schools, and we'll have even better schools if we actually invest in those schools, whether it's through investing in teachers, holding teachers accountable. Those are the kinds of things that people actually, that's exactly right. Libraries, parks, the things that people care about, and show that, I think we as an obligation we have to do that efficiently, but we need to remind people about what it is we're paying for. And I think we're at the stage in city government where it's very well managed. I think the mayor's put together a really terrific team of people, myself included, who are trying to manage the city to the best of their ability and really are using those resources in a way that gets you the biggest bang for your buck. And I think when people know that, then they kind of understand the tax structure.
So how did we get affected by the veto of the Children's Health Plan?
Well, I think that, I'm not a health plan expert, but well, listen, I think when this country doesn't take care of the least among us, we're really doing a huge disservice.
And then, but you can easily see the priorities. And I remember when Nixon was president, and we had this, and John Lindsay was the mayor, we had this urban priorities, the need for money to the cities, right? We still really need that. But now the president's come with more money for the war in Iraq and less money for the Children's Health Services, so you can see. But he's really not taking it out of the taxes because he's cutting taxes, right?
Cutting taxes.
So what is he doing?
Well, I think that, basically what the federal side is doing is saying we're not going to allocate money for new expenses. Now, remember, a significant number of the tax cuts that this president implemented are going to sunset. And so people are going to actually see a bump back up in their taxes if Congress does not act. So what I think many of the people who were promoting the health plan would say is, this is a great idea, so you don't give as much of a cut, and we're going to fund it that way. So that is the basic underlying way in which it would be funded, is they're going to not give as much of a tax cut.
But we're borrowing a lot of money.
We are borrowing a lot of money.
Can you explain that concept?
Sure.
Are we selling the country?
Well, one of the interesting things about the federal government that's very different from the city government, as you know, we have a budget and we have to have a capital budget that talks about debt. Now, the feds are in a really good position because they can always print money, to pay sort of debt. Now, as you keep printing money, it devalues the dollar a little bit, but they don't have as much planning for debt as we do at the city level. And I think there's lots that they can learn from the process that we undergo in the city level, which is we have a capital budget, we're looking at the capital and then figuring out what our debt service payment is to make sure that we can afford it down the road. And if you can't, then you certainly shouldn't be spending. It would be like you and I deciding we're going to renovate our apartments and end up not able to pay for that renovation. You have to make sure it's done in a structured kind of way.
So when we print more money, then the value of the dollar goes down. Is that why the value of the dollar is going down?
Oh,
it is down now?
The euro's doing really well. And without...
and the Canadian dollar?
I wish I knew as much as Greenspan did about this stuff. But, actually, you know what? We benefit a little bit from the dollar being a little weak in that in New York City, and I'm just talking selfishly, we love having international travelers. When they come, they stay longer. They fill the hotels. We get a little hotel tax revenue from their stay. And
they spend a lot of money.
They spend a lot of money while they're here. So we love international travelers, love domestic ones as well, but really like when international.
There are different types of taxes. They talk about, we have some talk about the flat tax, which is something. Then we have what we call progressive taxes and we have what we call regressive taxes, right? Is there talk ever about a national sales tax?
There is. It's a value-added tax. So you've heard people talk a little bit about value-added taxation. And essentially what that is adding a sales-like tax to the value of any kind of commodity that's sold. And there is talk about that. There's lots of people who think that would be a good way to actually go in terms of sales taxes, which tend to be regressive. And the reason why sales taxes are regressive, you know, the concept of regressivity is pretty straightforward, although we all make it complicated, so it's less accessible. But it's the notion of, does this tax vary based on your income? So if you're a household that makes $100 in income and you have to pay $10, you have a 10% rate. Whereas if I'm $1,000 of income and I have to pay $10, I don't, it's minuscule to me, it's a rounding error. That's a regressive tax, and the sales tax tends to be regressive. So would it allow us to eliminate the sales tax? What it actually would do is close, I'll call them a few loopholes. I mean, the issue with the sales tax is if you buy online, you don't necessarily pay it. If you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, it changes, and so it actually lends or leads to people saying, "Oh, I'm going to go shop in New Jersey today."
It's an honor system,
New York
isn't it?
City.
You're supposed to.
That's exactly right. You're still supposed to pay, but you know, how would you know? And so there are lots of talk about value-added taxes, and they are regressive. Don't get me wrong,
absolutely.
But at least it would be.
Would a flat tax be regressive also?
A flat tax is an interesting concept that, you know, had its heyday in the early 1990s when lots of presidential candidates were talking about it. But it is a little bit regressive. It would be saying no matter what your income is, you pay 1% of your income in taxes or whatever. And that tends to be a little bit more regressive. Many people, progressives, like progressive taxation with graduated rates, actually with us even able to return some income to people to try to lift them above the poverty rate. I mean, one of the things that we did last year that we're really proud of is try to get people their earned income tax credit, which is I mean, you know, the mayor really had this great effort about reducing poverty, and one of the key components on the tax system is to get people their earned income tax credit. And we took the unprecedented step of actually sending people who didn't claim the earned income tax credit a return telling them they were entitled to it. Really sort of different, so that they could get I mean, at the federal level, it's $2,400.
Yeah, it's a substantial amount of money to people. Very good. Now, let's go back to the city and the country. The president doesn't have to balance a budget.
That's correct. He puts out a budget. If it's not balanced, as I said, he could either write a little, push it out to the future, and does not have to balance a budget. The state are starting to talk about balanced budgets, but they haven't really had to do a balanced budget in the way that the city has. I mean, for many years.
We have to
balance our budget within $100 million, and if not, there's a possibility that the Financial Control Board will take over.
I'm always amused because one of the Republican presidential candidates, Rudy Giuliani, boasts that he has balanced the city's budget, but he had no choice, right?
Absolutely true, absolutely true.
He also says that he cut taxes 23 times. So what does he mean by that?
Well, I think that, you know, if you were to sort of look back historically in the 8 years when Mayor Giuliani was mayor, I'm certain that, you know, so he's taken credit probably for the hotel tax cut, which was sort of significant. I think he also did do some personal income tax, go and get the rate lowered a little bit. The property tax, I wouldn't say was cut during that period of time. I'm just trying to sort of think about the 23 thing. The hotel tax was another tax, which was a very, very interesting, but he's taking credit for that. I mean, I'm sure that that 23 number can be documented, but you know, it's all in how you
kind
count,
of way.
Right?
And then he said he turned a $2.3 billion budget deficit into a multi-billion-dollar surplus. But when Mayor Bloomberg came into office, he had to increase the property tax 18%. Was there a multi-billion-dollar surplus?
Well, you know, I mean,
I
think what you remember this from your time in the council is the trick of budgeting and revenue estimating is it's a tricky business. It's really not very easy. And so when Mayor Giuliani was about to leave office. No one had anticipated 9/11 happening, right? So right as he's about to leave, you make your budget estimates, you adopt a budget in basically June or early July, and that you have in it forecasts for the out years.
I see, so we had to include.
And the forecast for the out years definitely did not anticipate 9/11, and so as a result, there were revenues that we lost. There was a surplus predicted, and when we took office, that surplus basically evaporated. And mostly, I would not say as a result of any negligence on the part of the former administration, but some unanticipated revenue did not come in. You know, the businesses downtown weren't paying property taxes as a result. Huge effects on our tourism economy and
everything.
The like.
So that's very interesting, and we've recovered very well.
That's correct.
So we have one more minute.
Sure.
We do need a more sensible tax policy. Do you work? Is there a lot of coordination between the federal government, the states, and the local and the city?
I would say that each level kind of probably looks at their taxes in a bit of a vacuum. I mean, we at the city level know what we can do to influence our taxes, and then we hope to make sure that Albany is adopting the right tax policy and then doing whatever we can to also get the feds to adopt the right policy. So if they could address the AMT, that would be huge at the federal level. If we could figure out
the alternative minimum tax.
The alternative minimum. If they could do that, that would be huge. And also just a balance of payment difference. We send a lot more money to Washington and Albany than we get back. So.
Well, Martha Stark, thank you very much. I'm very pleased that you're the finance commissioner. I wish you were running all of the tax policy all over, but thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.